Architecture, model view controller. The IDE is a data-heavy, connected, fat client desktop application. There is a lot of information shown simultaneously on the screen. There are even parts that are shown multiple times on the screen. For example, if you look at here, the root node of the data in the structure of this component, it's the component music list. We see it here in the component structure, but we also see here the name of the component in the tab strip. We even see it here in the U-bar, but also here in the property inspector. So there's a lot of multiple views of the same data in the user interface. That kind of user interface requires a specific architecture. The Uniface IDE architecture is based on the MVC concept. MVC stands for Model View Controller. I got this picture here from the internet and it basically explains how MVC works. It's a matter of the user that uses the controller manipulates the model refreshes the data in the view, and then the view shows that data to the user again. And this circle is going on and on and on. For every change, this will be executed. That's the basic concept of MVC. Now in Uniface, we are already using the word model for something else, so I've adapted this concept to a bit more Uniface specific variation by renaming the model into data. So that's the only change for now. It says, instead of model, it says data. Another thing is that in Uniface we had the need to make an explicit distinction between data manipulation and a navigation. Yeah. So the controller does not only do data update, it also does what we call view state updates. I will come to view state later on a bit more. So a controller, if it manipulates data, the data is refreshed into the view, but the controller can also directly update the view state, and that is and skips modifications to the data. It will immediately affect the view. Yeah. So the user uses the controller to manipulate data, the data refreshes the view, which is then shown to the user, or the user uses the controller to navigate to another part of a view, yeah, and which is then immediately shown to the user. So we make a distinction between modifications, like this, and navigation that updates the view state directly. So clicking a tab is navigation. Making a selection is also done by updating the view state directly. Now then there is one more adaptation that I want to add to the diagram, and that's what is all the whole purpose of this using MVC, and that's that we can have multiple views. Yeah. So the controller manages basically multiple views. So let's have a different look at this same diagram, the same picture. In Uniface we have combined the controller part and the data manipulation or the data part into one component surface. Yeah, so this is one Uniface surface component. Every view is then implemented using one form. So that's one-on-one. So if we have, so the controller has multiple views. Every view then has its own specific layout. Yeah, and so the view is responsible for showing the data on a for that view specific way. The controller then manages the data which it gets from the repository, and that's loaded using normal frame-in-frame construction into memory. It also has the view state. We keep that not in the database, but we keep that in a separate zip file in the working directory. That is also loaded into memory. Both pieces of information, so both the view state as well as the data from the repository, are then loaded into a struct, and those structs are then formatted in such a way that they best suit the population of the various views that we have. So these are different logical views, as that the same data might be stored in the repository. In the repository there is a technical format or a storage format. In the struct there is a more logical format. Now, the next step then is to refresh the views, so references to those two struct variables are then passed to all the view components. Yeah, that goes as a struct by reference parameter, and then the views uses both structs to populate itself with its to show the information on the screen. Yeah, so that's part of the refresh. Now then the user can click somewhere or use the keyboard to generate an event. Those events go back to the controller, and within the controller they are managed by an event handler, and then the event handler determines what to do with it, and it's either a modification of the data, which is done then on the frame-in-frame set, or it is an update on the view state, and that is then directly done on the view state struct. Yeah. After which we then go into the second round. Yeah, during the refresh is invoked again, so the changes to view state and or data are used by the views to update themselves. And then it goes on and on and on, so it's really the same circle as over here, but then in a more detailed image. Now we're using one MVC construction per editor, and as you can see we have the possibility of having several editors open at the same time, which means that we have several of those controller view constructions in the IDE in parallel. Yeah? So we have multiple controllers, and every controller has its own set of views. Now next to that, to manage all those controllers, you need one special controller. We call that a main controller. Well, what's in the name? And that main controller manages all those editor controllers. And then the main controller also has its own set of views which are common to the whole IDE, so are not editor specific. So in principle, all the controllers with their own specific MVC implementation are completely isolated from one another. But as you know, in Uniface we do show information from other objects, like for example this is a modeled entity, and therefore it has inherited properties. Its description is inherited, its database behavior is inherited, and there might some other properties being inherited. And also here, for example, in the toolbox, this toolbox is a different kind of component, comparable to the Uniface 9 default objects that we have. It's even the case that this toolbox is already open. Yeah? We see here the toolbox, so here we can edit the toolbox, and in here we can use that toolbox. Now, that kind of inter-controller communication is also possible. We don't do that over the repository like in version 9. In version 9 you had to store information into the repository first before it could be shown in another object. In this kind of non-model environment that would not be very handy. So for this kind of inter-controller kind of data sharing, we allow controllers to actually define in their view state that their views can use data from another controller. So this controller also provides information to a view of another controller. So not only to its own controllers, but also, or to its own views, but also to views of another controller. Obviously, that kind of information is read-only. You cannot edit it, but it can be shown. So you can have the example that you are modifying your toolbox, and without saving the changes to your of the toolbox to the repository, you can immediately use that toolbox in another editor. Or the same thing, you can change modifications in a modeled entity, and then immediately, without saving that entity, you can immediately use it into a component. It is immediately available for you to use it. If you're going to compile, of course, you need to make sure that all the modifications will be saved, because the compiler will use communication over the repository. But as long as you're editing, you can have you can constantly switch between your object that you're using information from and your object where you're using the information in. So that concludes the part about the MVC. The next thing will be about view containment. I'm going to talk about it in the next movie. Check it out.